So, hello and welcome to another Crypto CFO's Watercooler Wednesday. Today, we're going to be discussing some of the regulatory items, I guess you could say, that have popped up in the last couple of weeks. Some are less formal than others. The first being related to Coinbase's lawsuit, related to their selling of what was accused to be securities. And we'll kind of talk about what the ruling was and kind of the impacts that can have. As well as the SEC beginning to investigate the Ethereum Foundation related to the Ethereum network potentially being a security and how it fares against the Howey test. So both of these cases could have a profound impact on the industry, and many of us on this call leverage the ETH network or EVM compatible networks, whether it's layer 2s or things like Binance Smart Chain or BNB or whatever. So I think this is really crucial stuff because, even if you just look at the stablecoin market, many of our vendors, our vendor partners, we work with Rise, they do payroll. And so if stablecoins are impacted for kind of global payroll acceptance, that could have a profound impact on the industry and things like that. So just kind of giving some background first off on the Coinbase lawsuit. So effectively, there's a lawsuit that was filed against Coinbase by some of its users who accused them of selling digital assets that should have been registered as securities, essentially saying that Coinbase was selling investment products without the necessary legal approval. So there was kind of a mixed ruling here, and there was a lot of nuance to it. So I think it's kind of key to understand what this victory was and what it wasn't too, right? So the court ruled that Coinbase might be responsible for selling unregistered securities, agreeing with the plaintiffs to some extent, but it also dismissed claims against Coinbase, stating that there wasn't enough evidence to prove that Coinbase directly engaged in securities transactions that would make them liable under certain sections of securities laws. So effectively, it was kind of like a no decision, and so as a result, it's effectively as if Coinbase was not really pinned with this tag of having sold unregistered securities on their platform. So it seems as if the court is saying that secondary sales of these, even if they were securities, the way in which Coinbase was selling them was not an investment contract like you would consider a normal securities offering, because it was a secondary market that they were providing. They weren't the initial issuers of these tokens, whether they're considered securities or not. That's kind of a moot point. What is key here is the way in which they went about selling them, and the nature of those sales wasn't considered the selling of unregistered securities, or there wasn't enough evidence to deem it such. So this decision is significant because it touches on the debate about whether digital assets are securities and whether they're subject to the same strict regulations. If this case had said, okay, yes, you were selling unregistered securities, what that would mean is that Coinbase would effectively have to stop immediately selling these, and they would have to pay large fines and go through the process of kind of going through the legal hoops in order to get these things sold. So they would, as a result, assets like ETH would have to be immediately removed from these centralized exchanges, which would make jumping into the digital assets market for U.S. participants incredibly more difficult. And if ETH is tagged as a security, a lot of the stable coins that live on ETH you'd have trouble transacting in those. So I think this is good that it played out as far as for the industry's perspective, really good that it played out the way that it did so far, but it doesn't provide us like a silver bullet to say that, any of these digital asset exchanges that are centralized are not selling securities. It's just kind of like kicking the can a little bit. So, this is ultimately kind of, they're not really holding Coinbase accountable for selling unregistered securities as of this point, but they're kind of highlighting that, hey, there's a chance that this could be tagged as such, but we don't really want to rule on this in this court at this time. So Yeah, Coinbase, as far as Coinbase's reaction on this, they welcomed part of the court's decision, interpreting it as a validation that trading cryptocurrencies on their platform doesn't automatically involve selling securities. And they emphasize the need for clear regulations to support innovation in the cryptocurrency space. So what this comes back to is, which a lot of these cases come back to, is they're saying that effectively the SEC and different regulating bodies like that shouldn't be the ones making the rules on this. We need Congress to act to create a framework for us to play and rules to play by. It shouldn't be the SEC's responsibility to be regulating by enforcement here. And I think that this is kind of another highlight of that, where it's like we need Congress to act to come up with a sensible regulation for the industry, so that we know the rules to by which to play by, and so that we have definitions so that we can hold companies accountable to this, right? Because if we don't have a the Howey test is from, I think it's the 30s, right? It's from way back when, right? So we're still using this antiquated system for determining whether something is a security based on, you know, a court case that's from almost a century old. And if we look at how much the markets have evolved and how different these digital assets are from the assets that we were talking about in the Howey case, in the Howey court case, it's profoundly different, right? And so we need a new set of rules, and we need, first of all, to define what does sufficiently decentralized mean, because that's a huge aspect in determining whether something's a security, because you need to see if they're involved in a common enterprise, right? And if there is a tangible third party that we can say, hey, we're relying on this third party in order to make a profit. Those are the key arguments that we have to overcome with the Howey test relationship to digital assets. And we need someone to define what those terms mean so that we know what rules to play by, right? Because without clear rules, we can't really advance the market. So that's the kind of Coinbase lawsuit. It was originally touted as like, oh, a huge win, like, you know, decentralized exchanges aren't selling securities. People kind of took that as, okay, no crypto assets are securities. That's not really the case here. It's just saying that like the secondary sale of these assets on these platforms, at this point, they're not considering that as an investment contract. So that's the key thing here. If we look at so we don't have anything formal yet from the SEC related to the Ethereum Foundation coming under investigation. We don't know whether they've gotten a what's the first step here? It's Wells notice, right? We don't know whether they've gotten a Wells notice or not. But I think a key thing to understand about the SEC potentially investigating Ethereum and the Ethereum Foundation is that they kind of have to decide where the line in the sand is, right? Because it sounds like the SEC is going after the Ethereum Foundation as of the switch to proof of stake, right? Which is when they're saying this became a security. But they're also looking at facts and circumstances from when Ethereum originally launched, which there's some really good arguments in place that ETH was a security at launch. There's a lot of evidence to say that. However, we've also heard evidence to say that something can change from a security to being not a security over time if the facts and circumstances change. It wouldn't be common for a normal business or a normal kind of organization to do that, but we're talking about a whole different asset class where you have heavy decentralization. Again, we haven't defined what that threshold needs to be for it to be a legitimate for it to be decentralized enough for it not to impact the and for it to not be a tangible third party, right? But I think so the SEC kind of has to decide which facts and circumstances it's looking at, because as of the switch to proof of stake, there's many arguments to say that at that point the network was sufficiently decentralized. And so I think we'll come down to ultimately what we're going to need to get back to is a definition of what decentralization means in the context of blockchains and decentralized distributed ledgers, and whether and what kind of tests we can put in place to say, hey, is this decentralized or not? So that's kind of the kind of high level overview of these two court cases that are, I mean, again, the Ethereum Foundation coming under investigation, isn't a court case yet, right? But it's kind of looks like it's moving in that direction. And it seems to be coming at a time when, we have the deadline for the ETFs approvals or denials coming. The last deadline, I think, is May 23rd. I might have the day slightly off here, but this may be the SEC setting up something so that they have an excuse to either push that further or to maybe wrap them up in a court case at that point in order to delay things or kind of kick the can a little bit. But one other key aspect of this is that the person that would bring this to court is not Gary Gensler, right? It's not I forget what his name is, but it's another man that's involved, and he hasn't really shown to really truly understand the digital asset industry. So we'll have to wait and see where we're at with that and kind of what happens with this. So love to open up the floor for any comments or questions, or what are some tests that we could have to determine whether something's sufficiently decentralized? What does that even mean, right? Yeah, just curious if anyone has any initial thoughts on this.
I think the important thing first is, how do we educate those that are setting these regulations? And like you're saying, it's just funny to hear, and I know it's the world we're in, it's the time we're in, but when you're talking about people who are setting these rules and these things that the entire industry needs to follow, and they don't know anything about, it's just funny to me sitting in my seats thinking of that and just saying, okay, so the people who are going to ultimately determine the United States position in Web3 don't know anything about it. Don't, not saying you have to be pro or against it, but you just don't understand the industry as a whole. So that's kind of scary to me.
We can offer free CCFO memberships to everyone that's involved in the SEC. We'll get them in here.
We'll have to reach out.
Yeah, totally. I think that we have to have education first and foremost, and we have to have people who know what's going on here and understand what's going on here, because it's similar to like when you had Facebook summoned for hearings with Congress, right? And they're asking them questions about whether Mark Zuckerberg can help you reset your password on Gmail. It's like, you don't understand what you're asking questions about, and you're proving it through the questions that you're asking. And so, what are we doing here, kind of thing, right? So if we're not on the same page as to how these things work, it's going to be a lot harder to have those conversations, right? So yeah, really good point, Brandon. I think that we have to have education for these folks. But these folks also have to want to be educated and want to be, want to learn about this stuff.
Well, and just some of the kicking the can types of things that we're seeing right now, I don't think it's all that surprising because we're in a major election year. And I suspect that nobody's willing to be the one that says yay or nay and either opens the floodgates or shuts it off. And so there's like this whole stare down going on, like, they're supposed to make the rules. No, they're supposed to make the rules, and nobody's making the rules. And it's going to take, it's going to take this election cycle. And just from experience, taking an election cycle to complete and to see where leadership is, to have total clarity. I mean, there may be some advancements made, and the Ethereum ETF in so many ways makes so much sense, but I wouldn't be surprised if this whole thing that's going on is, your observation is correct, that this is sort of like Ethereum is a little bit different, and we don't want to like really take a stand on that, so we're going to mess around and do a bunch of stuff until we have somebody's willing to give some clarity here and take the political, I mean, everything gets politicized. And so take the political stance that this is this, or this is not this, or, whatever that ends up being. I would say just in my mind, there's probably a lot of that type of maneuvering going on. And I also think that there's becoming a recognition of the massive financial impact that this has, and that makes it even more sensitive because more people are less willing to be the ones to draw the line in the sand. So just those are just some of my observations.
I think you're absolutely right. You see it with relation to like the rate hikes or the rate cuts, right? You know, we're very unlikely to see rate cuts in certain months this year because it will highly impact the election cycle, you know, or could be perceived as political, right? And so
Yes.
anything that could be perceived as political, you know, they're going to be very careful about that sort of stuff. And I think that, you know, I think you're absolutely right that we're going to see more kicking of the can, you know, and from a just purely like an image standpoint, they don't want to be seen as you know, leaning one side or the other. So good points there. I think that you're right on that. I think that one key aspect of this that I think indicates to me that I think that they are going to approve the ETH, and this is just pure speculation. This is not financial advice, but you know, BlackRock has I think it's like a 595 to 1 record on these ETFs. And I think that if they thought this was like an automatic, you know, no stamp where it's not going to get approved, I think they would have pulled their application at this point. And to see them doubling down on creating a fund for real world assets, for the tokenization of real world assets with Coinbase and with I think they partnered with Coinbase for that. I could be wrong, but I think it was like $100 million fund that they're starting to help with the adoption of tokenization of real world assets. Stuff like that leads me to believe that, you know, because all that stuff would be on Ethereum. These institutions, they really want this through because it's an ETF where the Bitcoin ETF was great for them because they make their fees on selling the ETFs and managing those ETFs. But with an ETH ETF, they have to hold the asset underlying the ETF, right? And so with them, if they're holding this asset, they can stake that asset and earn a 4% yield on top of the fees that they're already getting for selling these ETFs. So I think that the institutions really want this to move through. So I think right now we're seeing a battle between the banks and the kind of financial asset managers, which we haven't really seen before. We've always seen them kind of holding hands and lifting each other up. Maybe not always, but like they had a vested interest in each other. But now we're starting to see this rift being caused by the ability to make this incredible yield. Because when you imagine what I think that the ETH ETF it's not going to be as big as the Bitcoin ETF, but when you have this advantage for the institutions to be able to earn an additional yield above and beyond what the fees they're getting for selling the ETF, I think there's a lot of benefit from the institution. So I think we'll see some lobbying going on. But I think you're right, Carrie. I don't think that we'll see any stark moves from like any governing bodies. But we do have a deadline approaching with the ETF to say yay or nay. And we have precedent with the ETH futures ETF already getting approved. So, you know, I think the same argument will be made with the Bitcoin futures ETF. It's like, hey, you approved a futures. Why aren't you approving a spot kind of thing? So will be very interesting to see how this plays out for sure.
Well, and from a United States standpoint, just in, you know, because we're talking about United States regulators and politics, I think there's becoming a recognition, and you pointed it out right there, that there's a whole lot of money here. There's a whole lot of money, and there's a whole lot of money for institutions in the United States. And if the United States starts to shut that off, what does that mean? I think that if at the very least there's a recognition by people that may not understand what's going on, but they do understand money. And they understand lots of money. And, and that, you know, so that I think that's a very interesting part of the equation. It's going to be it's fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, and I'm also interested to see, you know, with, you know, depending on what happens rate cuts and things like that, and this is slightly, off topic of what we've been talking about, but I think that like seeing people start to realize how much additional money is coming into the circulation of just to service debt, but also, with these new spending packages that are $1 trillion plus, like that money doesn't come from nowhere. That money gets, well, it does, it exactly comes from nowhere. It's printed, it's brought into circulation from nowhere. So I think that people are starting to wise up as well to the fact that we need accountability in currency for it to have value over the long term. And we have a target of 2% inflation every year. So we have a target, like our target for inflation is to have it devalued at 2% every year, right? And so I think that all of this stuff is coming to a head, and I think that the ETF was the kind of tipping point for this industry, the Bitcoin ETF, because I think that it in allowing for more people to participate in the market without them having to actually hold the asset, the underlying asset, it allows for folks to become more educated or become more open to being educated on what Bitcoin specifically means. And I think that once people understand Bitcoin, I think that Bitcoin has a ton of value as a reserve currency maybe in the future. But I think that it's it's like a gateway drug in a way to the rest of the cryptocurrency market, which, to be fair to the critics, there's a lot of scams and a lot of BS tokens in crypto, but there's also a lot of real value and use cases that are happening there. And the more that institutions wake up to that, and the more that the government wakes up to the fact that, we don't want to shut ourselves out of this whole financial market. We're the US. We want to maintain our control on, first of all, the de facto stablecoin that is USDC. USDC and USDT are effectively a method for the US to continue to sell their debt, right? Because most of those stablecoins are backed by government debt. And when you have this liquid market for government debt, us participating in the crypto market is basically underwriting the US government spending too, in a way, because we're helping to support these vast networks of. So I think that the US government has an incentive that most people haven't really realized, that are involved in the government, the incredible incentive to digital asset markets where you have stable coins and where you have a demand for the dollar, right, on these networks.
Oh yeah, USDC is one of the best business propositions for the US that it hasn't even made itself.
Right.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
like being handed
Mhm.
like on a silver platter. And when people start to realize that, I had a conversation earlier this week with somebody who really was not familiar with crypto at all. And I talked to them about stable coins because it was somebody who's really interested in politics and involved in politics. And I talked to him about stable coins. And I was like, if you can't understand anything else, understand this. There has to be stable coins. And as long as the most popular stable coins are stable in relation to US dollar, that is a massive, massive win for the United States. And if we allow that opportunity to pass by, that would be that insanity. I mean, I know there's a yen stable coin that is, which makes total sense because the yen is one of the, one of the currencies that's often looked at as, a risk hedge. But, there will be others that'll, others there will be other solutions that will eagerly step in the shoes if the United States is not a friendly advocate of moving forward with this.
Yeah. And that's kind of my point back to what I was saying with education. It's not so much educating like we do in the community, this is how things work. It's just educating, to your point, that how much money can be missed out on, and generally speaking, and obviously we're US citizens, generally speaking, US has spearheaded and pioneered almost every single industry and became a massive player. And I think the education gap there is not realizing how big this space is and will become. And that's honestly what I'm more scared of, not, just some regulations that may hinder us from doing business in a few years. It's what's the 100-year implication on this? What is are we going to slowly fall to last place because the amount of money that can be earned and the amount of, and with the money comes the power. And, it's just, you start thinking about those things that'll happen well after we're gone, that's the scary part for me.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that I'm hoping that we get some movement on the broker regs and those become more sensible, because we've talked about this before, but that would effectively shut out a lot of the US participation in the market, because it would just be impossible for some of the decentralized exchanges to comply, and so they would likely geo-block US participants or find some other way to work around not including the US population. And even tools like MetaMask, based on how they were originally written, would be considered broker dealers, which they're just providing a user interface to the blockchain. They're not really providing any services that are have traditionally been seen as broker dealer. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But I agree with Carrie. I don't think there's going to be too much regulating happening in an election year. Seems like there's always an excuse, because every 2 years now we've got a changing of the guard too with Congress, and so we'll see how all that plays out. But I'm not holding my breath too long for clarity from Congress on this stuff.